Hey guys, so this week I have a very different episode for you. I wanted to honor an issue in our industry that is not often talked about, which is the environmental impact that tennis has. Today is International Sustainability Day, so what a perfect opportunity to address this. I really think that we can all do much better, myself included, when it comes to taking in consideration the environmental impact that our profession has. I think that most of us can agree with feeling a little guilty when we replenish our teaching cards with new balls. I mean, every time I do this, I'm just appalled at the amount of waste from each box, all the plastic wrappers, the lids, the cans, the old balls that we're now throwing away. It all adds up. So I wanted to talk to someone who is an expert and can help us shed some light on this. My intention with this episode is just to give you something to think about and hopefully to inspire you to take some actions that will make a difference, even if they're small. I love learning from Christophe, and in particular, his Scottish saying, which I decided to use as a title for this episode, and I will not try to say it because it is a tongue twister. But before I play you this conversation, make sure to check out our website at vidatennispodcast.com for other episodes and ways in which you can help support the podcast, like making a donation, buying our merch, or simply sharing it with other professionals in the industry. Another very easy thing you can do to show support is to leave a review. It takes 1 second of your day, and it really makes a difference in helping me grow this platform. Get ready to learn from one of the best out there, only here at Vida Tennis. Enjoy! Hello, everybody. Welcome to Vida Tennis, the podcast for those of us who eat, sleep, breathe tennis. Today, I get to talk with Christophe Firth. He's a partner at Kearney's communication, media, and technology practice, where he has been for 14 years. Kearney is a global management consulting firm that works with more than 3/4 of the Fortune Global 500, as well as with the most influential governmental and nonprofit organizations. Christophe is a lifelong racket sports player, and he's very passionate about sustainability, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Welcome, Christophe, to Vida Tennis. Did I get all of that right, first of all?
That's a great summary. Nice to be here. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you. And I always like to start with your story, how you got into tennis, and then how you got into sustainability, what you're doing now. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So this is really about combining two personal passions of mine. So I was an aspiring tennis player when I was a kid, and my mom tells me that when I was 2 or 3 years old, I was more interested in Borg McEnroe on TV than watching Mickey Mouse. And I was a big Bjorn Borg fan. Though on court, I was probably more like McEnroe. But I was a decent player, but probably not good enough to go pro. Although, as you mentioned, I've carried on holding a racket since then. Then on the sustainability side, look, my primary and also secondary schools in Holland and in the UK when I was growing up are really big on sustainability, quite progressive. So from quite a young age, I had a real awareness and appreciation for the challenges that the planet's facing, right? And really just the ability to combine my passions for tennis and sustainability. Yeah, it's just fantastic and very, very energizing.
Yeah, we definitely need more awareness around this, especially in tennis. I think we don't often think of sustainability when it comes to sports because we just view sports as such a positive, healthy thing. And it's not even something that we consider, right? But what are some of the main issues that the tennis industry needs to change or resolve to do better, to decrease its carbon footprint and just do better overall?
And look, I mean, overall, I agree. I mean, sports is a force for good, as it really can be. And, although that there are sustainability opportunities and challenges across all sports, including tennis, I think we should look at this glass half full in terms of the good that this sport can do for society and also for sustainability. But why tennis? Why tennis more than other racket sports? But if you look at it, I mean, tennis does by far have the biggest ecological environmental footprint out of all the racket sports, right? And the different elements to that. I mean, first of all, if you look at the travel on the pro tour, I mean, so Formula One style circuit in some ways, which means extensive air travel for the professionals, for their coaches, the physios, the whole entourage, right? So there's quite a big footprint even in that. And even for the amateurs who are trying to collect the ATP points, WTA points, just to go pro and move up the rankings. So it's a lot of travel. I mean, a top 50 player can easily take 80, 100 flights a year.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
And secondly, Yeah. Then secondly, on the power side, I mean, it's if you play in the evenings like I live in the UK, after dark, you need to put the floodlights on relatively early at this time of year. And a lot of the courts still have older style metal halide lighting rather than LED. And that's really very power intensive. And if you think about it, tennis court is relatively big for 2 or 4 people. Right? So you compare and contrast that with, let's say, a five-side soccer game where you've got 10 people on a similar kind of footprint, maybe only slightly bigger. It's actually quite a lot of energy consumption per sports person. And then really the biggest one, the third one, which I've been most focused on, is on the equipment side, right? So if you think about it, I mean, there's a whole range of racket sizes and ball colors as kids come up through the different grades. I mean, I've got 3 who all play tennis, and my garage is full of red balls and orange balls and green balls, and old yellow balls that are past their use by date. I'll come back to that later on. So it's much more. There's much more variety in the equipment compared to, say, table tennis or badminton or pickleball, right, where the equipment is much more standardized and also has a longer lifespan.
Excellent points there. And I just want to talk a little bit about the travel part, because is that something that you think would be easily changed just by maybe adjusting the schedule? What's some possible solutions there that maybe you've thought about?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, it's probably the hardest one to fix, right, out of those different components that I just ran through, because it is a global sport, right, and the tournaments are going to take place around the world, and that's not going to change easily, right? So there's no quick fix to that. I mean, the solutions have to be more on the onus is more on transportation providers, right? So whether it's on ground, even the air, as you start to get to more sustainable aviation fuel, and making sure that the environmental footprint of the players is reduced. But the actual volume of travel, yeah, there aren't really so many quick fixes on that unless you start to move to more regional or localized tours. But that would require a big shift and a big mindset shift within the industry.
Absolutely. I think that there's other reasons to consider changing the schedules. I think the schedule as it is also very disruptive to professionals, just to their lives and their performance, but also, the carbon footprint. That's something that I think a lot of people don't even think about. But yeah, I think that responsibility, that's really hard to put on the consumer, right? Or the traveler, to put that responsibility on them. But in your opinion, who has the most power in creating actual change? Is it the consumer? Is it the tennis companies, the tennis associations? Like, where do we start?
Yeah. Yeah, no, another good one, right? So, I mean, there's no single answer, but in sustainability, generally, consumer awareness is always a great place to start, right? And that covers, if you break it down, that covers the players, it covers spectators, it covers people listening to podcasts like this, right? Who are all involved in the overall tennis ecosystem. They need to understand the issue, and they need to also want the change and be part of the change. And it's also in the interest of the sport to do that, right? And as young people, and coming back to my 3 kids, if I look at the way they think about the world, it's very different to when I was growing up. But as they become more aware, more emotionally invested in sustainability, and more proactive in their choices around sustainability in their lives, they will gravitate towards sports that align to their values, right? Just like they'll gravitate towards other activities or consumer products that align to their values. So it's really in the interest of the sports to cater to that, to listen to that. And you mentioned pickleball earlier, right? So we might have pickleball players listening to this podcast. I believe it is the fastest growing sport in the US, and it's one that is attracting a lot of tennis players and former tennis players. The balls that don't deteriorate anywhere near as fast as a tennis ball. There's no string wastage. There's standardized bats, smaller courts. So it's inherently, just by design, a more environmentally friendly sport, right? So tennis has got competition for attention and for participation with other sports to actually attract and retain young players. But beyond that, right, who else has responsibility? Of course, the equipment makers, tournament organizers, and any other commercially driven organization within tennis is going to be playing to the consumer, right? So as the demand profile changes, they will also adjust their models. But at the same time, they play a key role themselves in raising awareness and interest and desire to change. So in the end, it becomes a circular process, almost like a virtuous cycle, where you have increasing awareness and demand for more sustainability from customers, but also increasing supply in terms of the products, the equipment, the tournaments, and the organization around the support that can positively reinforce each other.
As a tennis professional, we will go through balls really quick, right? Like we have to change a full cart of balls. Yeah. If we're teaching 6 to 8, maybe sometimes even 10 hours a day, we go through a full cart of new balls in probably a month. I mean, easily a month. We have to change the whole basket, right? Because they're just that. And every time I open a box of tennis balls, I'm just like shaking my head. There's so much in there that it's just even unnecessary. Like extra packaging, plastic around it, and then plastic around the rim, and then the lid. And it's just like, it's so much. And you don't realize it when you buy just one can and then you go play. But when you open a full box, you're like, whoa, this is a lot. This is a lot of waste. So what are the main challenges to change in that, to change in even the current tennis ball? Why do they use so much material in their packaging?
Yeah. The short answer is, in the end, it's marketing, right? But yeah. I'll come back to that in a moment. I mean, certainly, a lot of the research I was doing when putting together that paper that I wrote on this topic, and I was also astounded by the facts and figures around this. I mean, just for your listeners, about 325 million balls are produced every year, right? So that's around 10 balls every second. You can just visualize them just churning out of the machine, right? Yeah. So end to end, those balls would stretch from Flushing Meadows in New York to Wimbledon and on to Melbourne Park in Australia. Right, so just visualize that. And if you piled up all the balls produced since the year 2000, then that would stretch from planet Earth to the moon, right, and beyond. Right, so you can just digest that. And then to your point, right, only about 1% of balls are recycled. So you can just get an image of the waste that comes out of tennis. So how do we fix that? It's a really difficult one in the end, right? Because, I mean, you talked about the balls used in training. I mean, a professional, given the way they train, the way they hit, I mean, they'll burn through effectively about 10, 15 balls a day, right? They, of course, want to train with the balls that are used in tournaments, right? They wouldn't want to train with a sustainable ball. And then when they're on court and sent to court, it's a completely different feel. So that needs to, we're getting there, but we're not quite there in terms of breaking that, right? Now, if you look at the ball, right, there's the ball itself, there's the packaging. I mean, for the ball itself, I mean, you've got the felt and you've got the rubber, right? So as the two main components, obviously the glue that holds it together. Neither the felt nor the rubber are biodegradable, right? So, and put them into landfill, it's about 400 years before they decompose, right? So that's a problem. Right? You think about the ball stretching to the moon. All of those, the vast majority of those are in landfill somewhere right now as we speak. Yeah. So we do need to find a more sustainable ball that replicates the performance and bounce of the current balls used in tournaments on the tour. I mean, you're probably aware of the Wilson Trinity. That's really the first major breakthrough in terms of kind of mass-produced ball that is more sustainable in terms of having longer duration felt, in terms of having a thicker rubber core. And because of that, it doesn't need the pressurized container, and it's basically in a cardboard container, which is completely recyclable, right? Now, is the Trinity there in terms of replicating the bounce of a normal ball, if you want to call it that? Not yet. I mean, I play with Trinities quite regularly, and you can definitely play with them, but it does feel slightly different. So I think we're going to get there, but we're not quite there yet. Now, in terms of the other elements you mentioned, there's the tube, there's the cap, there's the plastic sleeve that most canisters have, and then there's the ring pull for the pressurized containers. Now, each of those has a different approach, right? And the tube, as you can imagine, the rate that you go through the balls, the tube is still probably in perfect condition by the time the balls are end of life, right? So yes. We do need to have some kind of circular process by which those tubes are returned and reused, whether that's through an online channel or through sports stores. It's not in place yet. But that would be the big one. On the sleeves, the plastic sleeves, again, that's pure marketing. in the end, right? So you could have instead the printing straight onto the tube as opposed to a separate plastic sleeve. Or there's some balls where I used to live in Australia where there's no sleeve at all on the case,
Yeah.
right? So,
Yeah, it's interesting because, for example, Wilson, they had the Trinity Ball, and I commend them for coming up with something, and hopefully that will grow. But I've seen other Wilson boxes, and they're terrible. So it's like you're doing this, but then the other, like the Wilson U.S. Open ball, still have all the stuff around it, and there's no change there. So it's just kind of, yeah, kind of interesting, I guess. But
yeah.
I wonder, like, would you be able to keep pressure in a carbon tube in a,
Uh,
even if it, like, maybe if it was thicker or something? Could that
yeah.
work?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, I guess look, I mean, Wilson's one, but I think that I think all the other manufacturers are the same. I'd commend Wilson for being proactive and bold with the Trinity,
Yeah.
but I think that it's an industry wide problem. But yeah, the pressurized containers, well, I mean, that can only come if it's completely airtight, and if you have a cardboard or paper tube like the Trinity comes in, then that would not be able to keep the balls pressurized. So I think you'd have to. I mean, again, I'm not a deep expert in the scientific side of things here, but I think you'd need the plastic or a metal tube to maintain the pressure.
I've also seen some machines that bring pressure back to tennis balls. I don't think they're very common for some reason. I actually have never seen one in person. I've just seen different things online for it. Have
Yeah.
you seen any of those, or do those work well?
Yeah, no, the technology is there to re-inject the pressure into old balls, right? So yeah, in theory, you can take an old ball, you can strip the felt, you can repressurize it and recycle it that way. So yeah, the ball recycling it's difficult, but it's not impossible. And yeah, the special machines that separate the felt and the rubber can then be ground into pellets and also reused for something else. Sometimes they're actually used to lay new tennis courts. So it's actually almost recycles back into the sport, right? I mean, those 325 million balls I mentioned, I mean, that could make about 16,000 new courts, right? Of course, there's a limit there. Otherwise, the whole planet would be carpeted with tennis courts, which I think you and I both love. But
Yeah.
you know, the limit to how many tennis courts you can actually make. So yeah, look, I think the technology is improving all the time. It's certainly getting there, and recycling tennis balls, reusing them in that way that I just described, it needs to be done in parallel with actually developing just more inherently sustainable balls that are potentially not pressurized in the first place.
There's one company here that I know that is in Vermont that does the recycling of balls, but that's the only one that I've heard of, at least around here. um,
Right.
but what can associations do to help? I think if you make it so that maybe like the Trinity Ball, for example, gets a little bit more support from associations, meaning like they say, look, this is the ball that we're going to use, right? Then players are going to start training with that ball, and there's going to be more of a demand for that ball because now they have to compete with that ball. So I don't know what your thoughts are around that.
Yeah. No, I mean you make a great point there, Jennifer. It would require like a kind of global sport-wide shift to a different type of ball. I think
Yeah.
it'd be very difficult to get the whole industry to essentially make that jump over. At least not right now, like in October 2023. But I think that as the more sustainable balls just get a bit closer in terms of the balance and the look and feel of I guess regular tennis balls, then yeah, look, that would be a switch to make. I mean, other things if you're thinking creatively, right? I mean, the yellow ball was. I mean, balls used to be white, right? I mean, before you and I were born, but the industry switched to yellow balls in 1972 and Wimbledon a bit later in '86. So, I mean, if you're thinking creatively, you could actually move back to balls without that dye, right? The yellow dye is obviously chemicals and it has environmental impact as well. So that would be another kind of creative way to think. Although the reason they switched to yellow is it's easier to see both
Right.
as a player and when you're watching on TV, for instance. So it's an option, but I don't see that one happening. easily. I think the other lens I'd put on this, Jennifer, is going back to the actual clubs, right, across the country. And the majority of used balls are not captured and recycled. And that is, I mean, that is one of the first places we should be starting. Right.
Yeah.
So when I was living in Australia, I mean, there was a program launched, it was actually last year, called Game On Recycling. And there was a collaboration between Tennis Australia, Wilson again, and also one of the major retail chains, sports retail chains in Australia, to basically put tennis ball capture and collection points in clubs across the country. It was also endorsed and supported by Alex de Minaur. So having a kind of top-ranked ATP player backing it just obviously helps the awareness and interest amongst players. So I think that's something that I'd like to see much more of, right? Because just having those bins in clubs where you capture balls and then the reverse supply chain around that to actually get them back, either to the manufacturer to kind of break them down, repressurize them, or to another destination to capture the rubber for use outside of tennis. That is together with the push towards enhancing the performance of more sustainable balls. These are probably the two biggest priorities I'd have in mind.
Yeah, I agree. I've been to, and I've worked at several clubs. Not all clubs do that here in the US, but some do, where they have the collection boxes for recyclable. And then you just send them out and then they recycle them for you. So that's a really, really good way to do it. And I agree. I think every club should do that. Even if they're seasonal clubs or year-round clubs, I think that it should be, it should be a facility. But
absolutely. And I think that incentivizing customers in the end as well, right? I mean, you could imagine a system whereby you or I could go back to a local sports shop with an empty canister and they would fill it up with fresh balls, right? And or you do it through online. You just return the empty canisters online and then get fresh balls at a lower cost than if you buy them new. Right, so simple incentive mechanisms like that to change behavior. Changing behavior really is what it comes down to. And people often think with their wallets, especially right now, given the cost of living challenges and whatnot, right? So if you give people an incentive to actually act more sustainable and at a lower cost to themselves and make it easy for them, that would be an interesting thing to do. And then look, the other thing people respond to, especially in the social media age, is if you or I were to start to recycle or return our balls, reuse the canisters more systematically, and get some kind of green stamp or accreditation that we are green tennis players, that's the kind of thing that people like to shout about on social media, right? And then you get kudos from your friends and fellow players, right? So putting in place some little ideas like that will change behavior and drive incentives to change behavior can really have quite an oversized impact.
That's a great point. And have you seen any advances in technology that you're excited about that will help tennis be more sustainable other than the Trinity ball and the recycle programs? Is there anything that is maybe coming up that people are not too familiar with that you can think of?
Well, look, I mean, I don't have any kind of secret knowledge or anything like to share, unfortunately, Jennifer. But certainly the technology, I mean, it comes back to technology we were talking about, right? In terms of the stripping the felt from the rubber core and repressurizing all balls. That technology is advancing rapidly. If you look at where it is today versus where it was like even 5 and certainly more than that years ago. Right. And I think that's the technology I'm really most excited by. So if you have that technology plus a reverse supply chain based on ball capture at local clubs and tournaments, that can have really an oversized impact in terms of getting to where we want to be.
That's definitely going to be the call to action from this podcast, is to make sure clubs are recycling all their balls or sending them out. And what about tournaments, the big tournaments, the Grand Slams? You're in England, you probably go to Wimbledon or the French Open. Do you see any tournaments taking any efforts to help?
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And Wimbledon's been pretty progressive around this. I mean, like, I guess visually Wimbledon with the grass courts and the laundered whites, it just inherently just looks more sustainable. But at the same time, in the background, it has the same challenges and opportunities as others, right? I mean, if a Grand Slam tournament like Wimbledon typically burn through around 50,000 balls, right, across the tournament. So yeah, the opportunity and the needs there. But what are they doing, right? I mean, I think there's probably three elements. I mean, first of all, like everything, you can act on what you can measure, right? So they've really gone quite focused in terms of measuring and reporting on the footprint and sustainability and emissions around the tournament, right? And really had a high level of disclosure. That obviously drives awareness amongst the public, amongst spectators, amongst players, and also when they're reporting it, it really drives a requirement for them to act on it, right? So that's certainly one. Then secondly, in terms of the power around the tournament, I mean, they've moved to LED lights. The vehicles around the tournament are all electric now as well. The electricity is based on renewable sources. And even small things like the lawnmowers for the grass are electric as well, right? So they don't use those kind of petrol lawnmowers. There's a lot of little nuggets like that as well, and solar power as well on site. And the third one, which I mean is going away from the kind of emissions point, is they really have a focus on sustainability around the food and beverage at the event. Right? I mean, you always associate Wimbledon with strawberries and cream, but there's a lot of other ingredients that they have, and they source local, they source seasonal from the UK. They have plant-based options rather than having people eating burgers and fish and chips, right? So they're really doing quite a lot around that. I'd still like to see them do more in terms of some of the topics that we just talked about, right? Around the balls and the canisters and that element of sustainability around the tournament. But certainly they're really starting to make the right noises and pass the right messages in terms of the importance of sustainability in the sport.
Yeah, I think every little bit helps. And I think people a lot of times I feel like people don't do anything just because it gets overwhelming. And it's like, well, why should I do this when one single player is taking in 800 flights in a year, right? So what would be your message to someone that maybe has had that thought or feels overwhelmed and thinks like there's just not much that they can do?
Yeah. Yeah, great. So, I mean, I'm Scottish. I didn't tell from my accent, but in Scotland we have a saying which is basically "money mickle mac a muckle," right? Which basically means that if you put together all the small pieces, then you actually end up with a big piece, right? And so it was in that spirit. Every little helps, right? And everything that you do, Jennifer, that I do, that the listeners to this podcast do, it all adds up, right? So I know that the problem might seem overwhelming when, as you say, you're looking at the volume of flights that players are taking. If you look at just the sheer number of balls, right? I mean, you're thinking if there's 325 million balls, and what's this one canister of 4 balls is going to make any difference? But we have to think that if you put all those individual canisters together, then you do get to that 325 million. So if we all do our part, then that will contribute to the whole. And then, then it's about raising awareness, spreading the words, extend the use of your balls, right? Just think, can I play one more match with these balls rather than chucking them and opening a new canister? Do I need to change the strings yet, or can they last a little longer without overly compromising performance? And then go and speak to your tennis club about putting a recycling bin, right, in the club. It's low effort, it's no brainer. If the infrastructure exists to collect in your local area, then it's easy. If not, then start to make some noise about it and ask questions of your local tennis association. And I think together we can really start to make an impact.
Absolutely. And I meant to ask you also about other equipment. Do strings have a big impact? Which would be the most environmentally friendly string? What about rackets? What kind of impact does the people buying new rackets every year? What does that mean?
Yeah, no, look, and rackets, absolutely right. And because you have all the different racket sizes, I mean, here again, there are a few different opportunities. I mean, first of all, rather than letting the kind of rackets, the smaller rackets, if you've got kids that are growing up, just gather dust in the garage, put them back into the sport, right? Whether it's selling them secondhand or donating them or just finding a use for them that would avoid someone having to buy a new racket and then all the materials that sit behind that, right? So that should be a relatively easier one. And then the other opportunity here that I'd like to see is the actual manufacturers being more proactive in terms of taking back secondhand rackets, refurbishing them, and getting them back out there, right? And like we're seeing that now in the mobile phone sector, right? So certainly in the UK, I'm sure in the US, elsewhere, refurbishing old phones, selling them at a lower cost than the new racket. Why does that not exist? New phones, sorry. Why does that not exist in tennis with rackets?
Right.
So strings are a bit more difficult, right? I mean, you can't recycle those as easily. It's more complicated. But if we start with the balls as priority, just given the sheer volume, and then go to rackets, I think that would already make a big impact in our sport.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And I always ask this is what has been the grand slam moment and the double bagel moment of your career so far? So the high and the low. We could talk about maybe on the court as a player or in the sustainability world. What has been like the highlight and the not so good part?
Yeah. I mean, on court, I mean, I was a decent player when I was young. When I was living in Amsterdam, I won one of the big under-10 tournaments in the city, beating a guy in the final called Bjorn, who had obviously been named after Bjorn Borg, with his parents aspiring for him to be a champion. And I went to that game with a real underdog mindset. And I just played the game of my life at the time. And so that's probably my biggest win on court, at least. I'll also just mention while we're talking about it, I mean, I've had such a high degree of interest from people like yourselves and others in the article I wrote and posted on this topic. That was a surprising high for me as well, because I never expected this level of interest in the topic. So that's a second high for me. I guess the low is, I mean, coming back to my career, was probably not kicking on from that. 10-year-old was when I hit my peak, right? And I wasn't able to kick on from there. I was a slow developer physically, so I wasn't much taller when I was 15 than I was when I was 10. I kept on falling behind my peers. So yeah, I think it ends up, I ended up switching away from tennis to badminton and ping pong, and I just rediscovered my love for tennis about 5-6 years ago, right? So yeah, could I have pushed through? I mean, you see some short players in the tour who have done pretty well, but yeah.
That's awesome. That's actually pretty funny. But hey, you're still healthy. You're still playing racket sports, so that's they're the lifetime sports. So that's the best way, I think, to stay fit and stay healthy throughout your life, is to have a sport that you can play. I mean, how boring is it to go to the gym and just get on a treadmill?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was in the US a couple of weeks ago, seeing my brother in San Diego, and he introduced me to pickleball for the first time. It's not taken off in the UK in the same way as it has in the US. Yeah. And I loved it. It was fantastic. I mean, the fact that I beat him obviously was a cherry on top. I've never played sport before, but yeah, look, you're right, Jennifer. I think it comes back to the point that sport has so much power and capacity for good in society and also in sustainability. I'm really, really thrilled by the opportunities, and thanks again for inviting me to join you today, and for the listeners.
And before you go, I was wondering, because there's got to be people out there that are doing great things in the sustainability world, in the tennis world. I mean, I think we all care. I think it's just we don't all take enough action at times. Are there any companies or any initiatives that you're aware of that maybe we're not aware of that you want to give a shout out to?
I mean, look, there are a lot of people doing a lot of good things. And what's energizing is that a lot of that energy is coming from young people, right? And there's a lot of passion and drive. But look, I mean, there's so many examples. I mean, one really interesting one in the soccer world over here is a small club called Forest Green Rovers. And they were way ahead of any of the really big soccer clubs in terms of saying, we're going to be sustainable. Maybe it's because they've got the word forest in their name. I know, right? But if you want some ideas in terms of how a pro sports club can really just take the initiative, despite being relatively smaller, they're a really interesting case study to look out for. So yeah, and that's one to check out. And look, why I also enjoy working with Kearney is that we are, I think, one of the first, if not, I think we were the first management consulting firm to set science-based targets around our operations to really drive sustainability in terms of how we work. Obviously, a very travel-intensive sector as well. So what I'd say is, like me, if you find an organization that really lives and breathes sustainability, where you have like-minded people around you day to day, and that would be probably the best way in which you can jointly co-create that high level of impact that you can have.
Fantastic. And I will make sure to link your article too, because that's actually how I found you, was through your article. I was frustrated. I was looking for things about what we can do in the tennis world. And your article was one of the first things that came up. And I was like, oh, this is so great. I got to talk to this guy. So thank you so much for taking the time. Actually, this is going to come out on Sustainability Day, which is the last Wednesday of October.
Thanks so much, Jennifer.
Thank you so much for listening. And if you're interested in reading Christophe's article, I have that link for you in the show notes, of course. What did you think of this episode? Will you do anything differently after listening to what Christophe said? Please let me know. You can always reach out to me at vitatennispodcast@gmail.com or find me on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube under Vita Tennis Podcast. I will see you next week for another exciting episode of Vita Tennis.